Hello. This is Chewing the Gristle with Al Black and Tim Conroy. We're a poetry chat, and our guest today is the poet Marjory Wentworth. Marjory Wentworth is the poet laureate of South Carolina. She's also an award-winning author. She's, of course, a poet and a children's author. Recently, the New York Times has talked about her book, Out of Wonder, Poems Celebrating Poets with Kwame Alexander and Chris Colderley. With that, I'm going to turn this over to our first question and welcome to our guest, Marjory Wentworth.
Well, it's great to be here. Two of my favorite folks, Al and Tim.
And Marjory, what I'm curious about, and I think emerging poets like to hear about your journey into poetry, whether you started to write as a child or an adolescent, who were your possible teachers that influenced you, and a little bit about your poetry education.
Okay, so I think like a lot of people, I started writing poetry when I was maybe in middle school, junior high age. So we used to call middle schools back in the day. And I've found going into schools now as a poet that it's pretty common that kids start writing poetry in like 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. In my case, my father was diagnosed with cancer and died when I was in 9th grade. And I think the writing poems helped me process all that confusion and grief and you know, when you're that age, you don't want to go to school and talk about it, you know. So poetry really helped me. Now, interestingly enough, poetry was available to me because I'd always liked it. I'd always read it. My father actually loved poetry. He majored in English literature. So it was, you know, something that I was exposed to, and I always just kind of loved I loved poetry. I loved, you know, Robert Frost was really I was raised in New England, so I was kind of raised on Robert Frost. But, you know, not everybody has poetry around them when they're growing up. So I felt like that was just a really lucky me, you know, that I was able to do that. But I think a lot of stuff that influenced me then were also song lyrics, you know. I was a child, I think, you know, in the 60s and listening to the Beatles and Bob Dylan and all that. And so a lot of my songs kind of imitate like those songwriters, but that's okay. So that was really how it started. And then in high school, I was able to take a creative writing workshop, which was really great. And I realized other people wrote stories and poems. In college, I didn't major in English. I actually majored in anthropology and political science. But I took some writing workshops and met other people writing poetry, and then got married and moved to New York City and took some workshops at the 92nd Street Y, which you guys have probably been to or heard about. Studied with some great poets and met other young poets. My really good friend then was Sophie Cabot Black, who's really, I think, one of the great American poets now. And we'd go to these workshops. And I worked in the daytime in refugee resettlement and would go to these things at night. I'd never been to a poetry reading until then. And then I applied to graduate school at NYU and got in. And it was great because the classes were at night, and you know, I could work during the day, and Galway Canal ran the program. And then I studied, of course, with Galway, and I studied with Louis Simpson, Phil Levine, Carolyn Forche, and Joseph Brodsky. So wow. If you step away from it and think about it, these were Pulitzer Prize winner, National Book Award winners. Joseph won the Nobel Prize. And it was a very small department. Now it's really huge. It's become a very big creative writing program, all because of people like me. No, I'm kidding. You know, Yusef Komanaka is now the director of the program. Terrence Hayes teaches in the program. And, you know, I people like, wow, you went to NYU, man, you know. But I was very fortunate. I was able to study with poets that I really loved. And it was amazing. I actually worked as an assistant for Galway Canal, and I was at like transcribing something for him when the phone call came that he won the Pulitzer. You know, that's how it happens when you win the Pulitzer. The media calls you. You don't even know. So anyway, it was a really amazing experience. Carolyn Forche really became a mentor because I was writing at the time about refugees and human rights issues tied to the work that I was doing. And she immediately kind of took me under her wing, and, you know, we're still friends, which was amazing. Her son came and stayed with us for a while a few summers ago because he was a young filmmaker and kind of did some projects with my husband. So we're still friends, and now I get to teach her books, which is really cool. Galway, of course, and most of these poets have passed away. Galway, Louis Simpson, Joseph Brodsky died fairly young. Phil Levine, of course, has passed away. But, you know, I just feel like I was so lucky to be in that orbit. And like I said, it was really small. There were only enough students to have, I think, two poetry workshops and 2 fiction workshops. I'm still friends with a lot of my friends from grad school. I may be collaborating with one of them on a children's book soon. So I was just very fortunate.
Hey, Marjory, for the poets out there, can you hold up the anthology, Carolyn Forche's anthology?
Oh yeah, okay. So here, well, this is her, this is the anthology that she edited of poetry from around the world, poetry sort of witness. And then my students, I think it's, I don't know if it's here or not. Wait a minute, let me get it, here we go. This is her memoir that was a National Book Award nominee last year, all about her experiences in Salvador. And my students loved that book. Gosh, they loved that book. They really got a lot out of it. And they learn a lot. They learn a lot about, you know, the U.S. role in Latin America, particularly in the 70s. They learn a lot about just how a writer has to just sort of be open and go into an experience and absorb it and be brave. And, you know, there's a lot about it that they love. And of course, it's incredible writing. So that's just been really great. And she has a new poetry book out, actually, that just came out. First book in a long time. So yeah, and I you know, Galway ran the program, and he was just such a great, nurturing kind of presence. He loved teaching and kind of created a feeling of, you know, you just felt very safe in that little community. And I think when you're young and you're starting out, you have to feel like your work matters and that you're being supported. And it's really important. You know, we'd go on writing retreats and stuff and cook together, and all of us, you know, it was great. It was like another family. And that's really great to have this community around you and that you trust. It's really important. Now, I didn't publish anything until many years later, but the first poem I published was a poem I worked on in workshop, particularly with Phil Levine. And he told me it would be the first poem I ever published, and Galway told me where to send it. So, you know, it was great. It was a million years ago, but it was a great start, and I'm very fortunate. And I still go back to things that I learned there. I don't think it wasn't even an MFA. It was just a master's in creative writing, you know. So, anyway, that's the story, and lucky me.
It's been a good ride, and it'll continue to be a good ride.
Yeah.
I have a short question, and then I'd like you to maybe read, you know, 3 or 4 poems, depending upon the length, and then we'll have some more questions. But my question is, of the poets that we're seeing today, who do you really like that's the new poets?
New meaning,
Well, that you're reading, that are coming out with books today and that you read.
well, you know, I'm really excited about a lot of the Asian American poets, the young Asian American poets, that I've been reading mostly in magazines, but I'm really excited about that. I've just always loved um, Asian poetry, and I'm very excited that Asian American poetry is really kind of coming into its own. I've been reading Terence's book of sonnets that I just think is absolutely brilliant. I really love the way contemporary poets play around with the sonnet form. What's that book, American Assassin? Something like that. You guys read that book? It's, oh my God, I love it. It's just dazzling. He's such an interesting poet in terms of just the patterns that he finds with not only words but also just you know, letters, you know. That I've just been really kind of obsessed with that book. Gosh, I don't know. I've been a little, I feel like I've been a little out of the poetry loop because my last two books were not contemporary poetry. And I'm sort of kind of just getting back into the poetry world. Carolyn's new book I'm really excited about. Although I'd read a lot of those poems published in other places. So, you know, I'm not sure. I feel like there's a lot of really exciting new poetry. I'm really excited that Joy Harjo is our U.S. Poet Laureate. I love her work. I love Tracy K. Smith's work. But I feel like there's a lot of younger poets that are just doing dazzling work. Ilya Kaminsky comes to mind. I think Deaf Republic is one of the best books of poetry. I don't know if you have seen this book.
No.
I think it's dazzling. He was nominated for a National Book Award. It reminds me of, it's kind of a fable, a metaphor for what happens in war. It's one of the most original books I've ever read. I love that book. And he and Jericho Brown are both in Atlanta now. One's at Emory, one's at Georgia Tech. I forget who's, but he's somebody I've long admired, and I love that book. If you guys haven't seen it, I highly recommend Deaf Republic.
What would you like to share with us?
Oh, I don't know. You know, well, I guess I'd like to. I think I'll share a couple of poems from Out of Wonder, if I may, because the spirit of the poems written to celebrate poets, other poets, really comes to me today. So I'm going to hold the book up because here's the cover, and you can see it's for children and it's really bright and colorful. But just I'm thinking about some of the poems that I wrote in this book, and I really feel like reading the one I wrote about Rumi, because you know, Rumi, of course, wrote centuries ago, but he's very popular. His translations are very popular, thanks to Coleman Barks. But I think this poem makes us think about what we need to appreciate, and right now, we need to think about that. So I want to spin a song celebrating Rumi. Walk out of your room beneath the morning sky, let the sun enter your heart, and find a way to keep it there. Make a song from the light falling through the air, and dance even when you are alone. Dance if you are still sad. Dance when you are tired. Dance until your feet lift off the ground like wings, and later, when the stars are spinning in the night, put your ear to the ground and listen to the songs rising up from the earth. Everywhere you go, there is music. So of course, that's written for children, but I often read it at readings and at the end of a reading, because it just captures the essence of Rumi, I think, and it makes me feel good, you know. So I wanted to read that poem, and I might read another poem from that book, because it was a really interesting challenge for us to think about poems that would somehow celebrate the poets that we really love, that children often don't get exposed to because they aren't in the textbook, you know. So I'll read one other from here and then maybe a couple of others. This is one about a poet that most of us have heard of, Billy Collins, right? And he's known for his funny poems, but what I like about his poems is when I read them, I feel like I'm sitting in his kitchen and he's making me a cup of tea. And you just drank a sip of something there, Al.
Yes.
So I wanted to write a poem that would sound like something he would write, sort of the essence of his work, but I wasn't able to capture the humor, unfortunately. I think I did have it in there, but some of it got cut out. Anyway, how Billy Collins writes a poem. When you first wake up, notice how your mother's voice calling you to breakfast sounds like a fire alarm. Watch the steam rising off your oatmeal like tiny clouds and guess where it goes. Pay attention to the smallest things, a fly buzzing near the kitchen window, bright rocks in the driveway, the handful of marbles in your pocket, the sound they make when you walk. Imagine that the leaves spinning in the wind on the walk to school are are alien ships, and that barking dogs belong to a prince. At night, when the stars seem close, reach up and grab some. Our lives are made from these things, and when you describe them, you discover magic. It's the way your pen becomes a wand in your hand, and this may be the only thing you need to know. So those are just fun, uplifting poems, which we're all looking for right now, right? I don't know, I am. Do you want me to read another couple? Or what do you want me to do? Yeah? Okay, I will. Here's a poem. You know, when you're a poet laureate, you have to write a lot of occasion poems, you know, for things like governor's inaugurations sometimes. But other things like the opening of a bridge or a lighthouse or a graduation. So I have had to write a couple of graduation poems, and this is another poem that came to me that I wrote for a college graduation in Charleston, maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And the poem is called A Place for You. And it's a poem that also reminds us about listening to our own voice and finding our ways through difficult times. And you know what graduation speeches are like. I tried to put that in a poem. A place for you. Take time to hover at the still mouth of this ancient harbor, then rise into the air which holds a place for you. Let the wind off the sea lift you up and hold you above the daily cacophony. Before your hours fill with unintentional clutter, the way small clouds seem to occupy the sky on days you are not paying attention. Do not ignore the ordinary, each drop of gray drizzle, every stone and snapped twig, all the creatures thriving here. Because there are questions with no answers and many days you will wish to forget, savor each hour of sunlight when it permeates the sky, streaming through you like music. Listen to the glittering wings beating within the engine of your heart.
That's amazing.
It's the one poem that keeps coming to me now that I've written that makes me, think about why people read poetry at these difficult times. There's something about that poem that it was really meant to remind the kids, like, it's going to be tough sometimes, but here's the, the things to think about so that you can get through it. Anyway, I don't know.
Marjory, for emerging poets, it was really interesting to hear, your remembrance of your father and the grief, and sometimes how strong emotions are a place for a poet to start.
Mm-hmm.
You seem to have sort of kept the ability to let your emotions guide you in what you write. And I commend you for that so much. But, maybe talk a little bit about words of advice for the emerging writer dealing with strong emotions in poetry.
Oh, that's a really good question. And I absolutely think that we crave poetry when we're feeling the most, intense emotions. That's why people always read poems at funerals and weddings, right? So those are the two extremes. I think you got to be careful because the emotion should come from the imagery. The whole thing that we always try to do with writing, show, don't tell. One of the difficult things as a teacher is when students sort of pour their heart out in something very emotional, but the writing is horrible. You know what I mean? It's just, now when I've taught in a hospital, which I did for years, particularly when I taught cancer patients, it wasn't like teaching college students or serious writing students. It was about the process of writing. And if that individual who was really suffering with what their, fear and anger and all kinds of things, if they got it out on the page, A+, right? A+. That's different than a really well-written poem, It's a very contained, you have to contain it and control it. I think a great way to learn how to do that is to really study haiku. I think haiku, which, people tend to think, oh, I wrote those in 3rd grade. It's about the syllable count. Well, the syllable count, in my opinion, is important because it certainly teaches you to control the line. But what I love about haiku is the restraint and how everything comes from the image. And the power of suggestion is so important in haiku. So I think if you really read, good translations, or there's a lot of people who write haiku in English. Richard Wright, by the way, who wrote Black Boy and Native Son, wrote some of the most beautiful haiku in English I've ever read. I think you can sort of learn to control that emotion through image. So I think that's what you really have to master. And, just be careful that the emotion doesn't, you're not telling people how to feel. You have to show them. And usually that's through sharing details. There's ways to do it that in so many great poets you can read to kind of learn that skill, so that it's that what is it? Mallarmé said poetry works on the power of suggestion. So it's finding just the right image or telling the right narrative, that other people, that touches other people, and then they feel, oh, that's exactly what I feel like. She gets it or he gets it. So let the image do the work for you at the beginning. I think that's really the way to start, if that helps.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Our next question, or at least, we've discussed you quite thoroughly before we had this interview.
You guys have way too much free time on your hands.
Well, we've been retired for a while. So this isolation thing is not new for us. What we've had to do is learn to make our own coffee instead of going out to coffee shops. But my question now would be, last summer, you spent part of the summer in India. if I go sit on the porch, that's my retreat. Uh, explain this retreat that you went on and what impact you think it's had on you and will have on you.
Okay, well, I was invited by a school to come. I was like a visiting scholar, visiting writer. So, you know, you don't get paid really anything to be a poet, but you do get some really cool free trips and opportunities. So I was invited to go to this school called the Woodstock School, which is was founded by missionaries, and it's in a little town. It's in a town called Missouri, which is actually the first place that the Dalai Lama went when he went into exile. He lived there for a while. So there's there's a Tibetan community that's there, and also in the town. So the school is called the Woodstock School, and I was invited to be there with their students, but I really only was with the students maybe a week and a half. Like I was able to just kind of be there and meet people and walk around and adjust to the altitude, and so it was an amazing experience. I mean, the person who came after me, for example, is a paleo artist, which is exactly what you think it would be, somebody who is like draws dinosaurs. Okay, that's what he does, and he did the dinosaur drawings for Jurassic Park when Stevens, so they find just through word of mouth all kinds of people to augment the students' education, because they're so far away from everything, and they're so it's just this little town way up. It's like 7,000 or 8,000 feet up, that they bring in people to speak to the students. So it's a high school, boarding school for students mostly from Asia, but there were students there from Somaliland, there were some Americans, they were from all over the world, and then they have, K through 12 as well. And people who work there and live around there send their students there. So very international, which was part of what was such a rich part of the experience. I felt very lucky to be there. I couldn't go now, actually, of course. They're under complete lockdown. And the place itself is one of the most beautiful places I've ever been in my life. And I don't think most of us we think of like the Taj Mahal or something like that, or the Ganges, but I don't think people think of India and the landscape as being the most beautiful place you've ever been. And it was for me. I was, in the foothills of the Himalayas. I mean, it was just absolutely stunning. And what was interesting about the town I was in, because there were so many Tibetans there was also a mosque, and there were some churches. At a time when India, has a nationalist leader, and who's most of the people are Hindu. I felt like it was a very pluralistic kind of place. A lot of people go through there on the way to hiking in the Himalayas. So that part was very interesting. I'm sure if I'd been in the southern part of the country, it would have been a very different experience. I mean, it's a big, very varied country. I loved going to the monastery. The Tibetan community is really has they have their own schools, their own, it's like a separate town. And that was a really amazing experience. So I just loved it, and I'm still kind of processing all of it. And I didn't really write any poems exactly, although I've got something I'm working on. But I wrote little tanka poems, just little, they're like haiku, but they have 2 more lines. And I think of that kind of writing when you're traveling is kind of like keeping a sketchbook. You just kind of making notes. I'm actually wearing a kurta, which, is kind of what you wear there, very practical for here because it's hot, and you just kind of throw them on and they're really comfortable. So it was a great experience, and I'm really grateful for it. I'm quite concerned about everyone there now, because some of the you know, I was working with the students and got to know the teachers and just really became part of the place in a, you know, very short period of time. And some of them felt like, some of the ones who were actually from India felt like they were safer staying that far north and did not go back to where they're from, which, you know, like Mumbai. Others have had to leave very quickly because the fear is if, you know, coronavirus does get up there, you know, there's one tiny little hospital. So, you know, they really locked the country down. While I was there, India went into Kashmir, as you probably read about, and a lot of people in the community where I was are from Kashmir. So that was quite an education, learning about that history. By all accounts, Kashmir is truly the most beautiful place in the world. But, you know, they were just locked down and could not communicate with anyone. So it was interesting to be there while that was happening. So, you know, it was just, I was like a sponge. I just learned so much. And I also learned those monkeys, they're cute, but you don't want to get too close. They'll eat the food right out of your hand, you know.
Or your hand.
Yeah, or your hand and your hand, yes, for dessert, yeah.
Do those stories bring you to want to share a poem with us about anything that jarred, any memory that, or?
Well, let me see. I actually, maybe I wonder if I can find it. I kind of put everything I'm working on a clipboard. I mean, I can't even find it. Yeah, and I also was really lucky. I had a fellowship and went to Ghana with some writers, and maybe I could read that poem. I was asked to write a poem for a photo exhibit, and I might be able to find that poem, although I have a lot more notes. My favorite thing in Ghana was the crazy street signs. Oh my God, the street signs are hysterical. And I can't, let me see, if I can't find it, I'm not gonna be able to read it. I might have it here. I think I do, and I'd like to share that because it's a new poem, or fairly new poem, but I just have to find it. Oh, no, okay. Oh, no, if I can't find it, I won't read it. I'm sorry. I don't know where it is. Oh, I know. I guess I could read another poem about another place. How's that?
Perfect.
And this is a poem. I haven't even sent this out, but when I was in high school, a couple years after my dad died, a friend of mine was going on one of these exchange programs, like you go and live with a family for the summer, right? And my grandmother was a neighbor of theirs, and she heard about it, and she said, "You need to do that. I'm gonna send you on this program." So she paid for it and sent me to France. Everybody should have a grandmother like that, right? Lucky me. So I was there. I went for a summer, you know, and I was maybe the summer after junior year, I guess. And so every summer after that, I was working at some crazy job. But so I was there during Bastille Day, and this comes from that memory, and it's in a town called Libourne, which is down near kind of in the Bordeaux, you know, Bordeaux region. It's called Bastille Day, which of course is July 14th. As evening descended and the light turned golden at the end of the workday, after long baths and a clean shave, hair set and shoe shine, after taking the freshly pressed Sunday clothes off their hangers, zipping into trousers and breezy summer dresses, farmers and their families piled into cars for the drive to town. As the vineyards emptied, the square filled with vendors selling balloons and candy, a band played beneath the tent, French flags unfurling from windows above every shop. Wine was sold by the glass. I wore a new green and white dress and danced with a tall American boy with dark eyes that only watched me. For the first time, I knew the sheer wonder of love, the way it overtakes you unexpectedly. It was like walking into the sea without turning back. And though I don't remember the moment of surrender, I can still see the old couple beside us holding hands, singing the Marseillaise as the sky lit up with fireworks. The way the man suddenly paused to watch his wife sing before kissing her on the mouth, and the look on her face that followed.
I was, one of the things when I read your poetry, sometimes your poems about dark subjects have the sun, the river, they have golden images. They have this juxtaposition in those poems. Like I'm thinking of rain coming from a bright sky, poems like that. In One River, One Boat. In some of the subjects. Can you talk a little bit about how juxtaposition can work in poetry, how you're drawn to sort of tough subjects?
Well, in terms of juxtaposition, it's interesting you say that, because I just taught a Zoom class on Miklos Rednadi, the great Hungarian poet who was killed, at the very end of World War II, really. And his wife, when they found the bodies, his wife found the poems in his pocket. It's kind of a famous story. And I love those poems because he's the master of that, of this juxtaposition of, he was on a forced march, right, back to Hungary, and saw people shot in front of him and was beaten and starved and everything. And yet he'll suddenly look off and see a little girl tending sheep, or he'll suddenly think about, a beautiful memory with his wife. Wonder if he's going to get back to that house, in the summer, and that's what I love about his poetry. I don't think you do it that consciously. I think it's just the way the mind works, and that, despite despair or what have you, there's like moments of beauty that poems celebrate, probably as well as any other art form, and that's where the hope lies. Well, it's interesting, you say I'm drawn to dark subjects. I think I think the first time I did a reading here, it was Los Piccolo Spoleto, I think, yeah. And a friend came up to me and said, that's like, you're almost like a schizophrenic. Like, that work is so dark, and you're always cracking jokes, and you're always, so, I think the writing is separate from the person, for sure. I suppose my work is dark because I really started writing out of a way to try to understand such great loss, maybe. But I've also worked in, the field of human rights, and felt that I should be writing these stories, and, writing about things that maybe wouldn't be paid attention to otherwise. I'm always interested in the ways in which poetry sort of tells our history through the details of the lived experience, which is not in a history book. I don't know if either of you ever took art history. I only took it once, but when you study art, a painting, you learn about the painter, you find out who commissioned the painting, you learn about the political situation in which this person painted, and what the religious norms were, the cultural norms. And, somehow that all comes to bear on the painting. That's how I think we should look at poetry. In other words, you can learn about historic events, but think about World War I, for example, which suddenly is all over the place, right? The movie 1917 or whatever. Where do we go to learn about World War I? We read the poetry of Wilfred Owen, right? So I think that the poems that describe the particular human experience in any situation really articulate, whether it's the human cost, the suffering, in whether it's refugees or war or what have you. It transcribes that, and that's often a story that doesn't get told. I mean, I think that, when we're looking at even now, policies and situations in the world, we don't consider, well, what's the impact on the human being? What happens to the human beings who live there? That's the story that poetry tells.
I say this, your poetry sometimes takes on these dark subjects, but you always remind us of our connectedness, in these poems, and and there's always an underlying great hope in that. And so, I just really love your poetry.
Oh, well, I love your poetry. I don't know. I mean, I think the other quality about any kind of writing, I think, is the redemptive quality of writing. In other words, if something horrible happens to you or to your community, or you read about something and you can write about it, whether it's fiction or poetry or nonfiction, you pull it out of the ashes, and then other people can experience it. And there's something redemptive about that, which is really, really important. And I think people sometimes forget that. And then, having some hope in the darkness. I mean, that part of that is saying, yeah, we've been through this, but we're going to be okay. The human spirit endures. We create a community. And I think that's why people are really reading poems right now, because we find poetry that helps us celebrate what we love, and also reminds us that, we get through these dark times. I mean, we've been through horrible, pandemics before. And, you have to find what hope you can and bring that in, because if we all feel hopeless, you don't get through anything. So then then it's just, you go down that dark tunnel and never come out. And I wouldn't want to do that as a writer, let alone for the reader, right?
Okay. I have one more we have one more question, and then we would like to end up with a poem of yours. And the question is really, in your position as a poet laureate of South Carolina, a few years ago, you wrote a poem that the governor did not want read. And it actually then became a national, I think it became, she made that poem a lot more important, possibly, than it would have been if it had just been read in South Carolina. It became actually a national cause. Can you talk about what happened and what continues, whether it continues to have an effect on your role as a South Carolina?
Yeah, I mean, it was such a shock because, and let me say that I was really influenced by Elizabeth Alexander and Richard Blanco and their poems for President Obama, which really talked about people and different kinds of people. And I was thinking about, when you read an inaugural poem, you're on the State House steps, and just a handful of people are there, or I shouldn't say a handful, I don't know how many. Well, there's a lot of people there, but most people are, at work, doing whatever they do that day. And what about all those people? And also I was thinking a lot about what was going on in terms of unarmed African Americans getting murdered by policemen, or, Trayvon Martin. I think Michael Brown had been killed the summer before that. And I was thinking about history and South Carolina's particular history in terms of slavery, and how that was kind of holding us back. I also did a Facebook post maybe in early December saying, hey, I got to do another inaugural poem. I want to write about, you know, the things that matter to other South Carolinians. What do you want to, you know, and people sent back a lot of responses. So part of the poem was created from that, which was, you know, what do they call that when you, anyway, but that was really kind of fun. So anyway, you're not being allowed to read the poem was a surprise, because I thought they'd vet it and there'd be a conversation or something. I don't know. But of course it did get picked up, and Jim Clyburn reading it into the congressional record and doing a speech about the poem was one of the greatest honors of my life. Alison Bechtel, who wrote Fun Home, which has had its own controversy in South Carolina, she sent me an email. She read the poem and she said something like, you know, you'd think that they'd learn, you know, the more if you say to people, don't read that, or we're not going to let you read that, then everybody wants to read it. Right? That's the way it works. Like a little kid, like, don't eat that, don't get into that, don't eat that cookie. Well, you know, the kid's going to go eat the cookie. So anyway, it's kind of like that. But also to say that that poem in particular was very much appreciated by African Americans, particularly African Americans in South Carolina. And I got letters and emails from complete strangers who just felt like I'd stepped up for them in a situation that, you know, they were really grateful for it. Jim Clyburn called me and said that everything he wanted to say about his life was in that poem. I mean, how do you top that, right? That's, to be able to have that kind of empathy is what you want to do as a writer, right? Now, you could never have predicted that that was January 2015, that in April, Walter Scott would get shot in the back by Michael Slager, that we'd have the Emmanuel church shooting that June, that all of these horrific crimes that were clearly tied to racism would happen here. You know, then I ended up co-writing a book with Herb Fraser and Bernie Powers called We Are Charleston, Tragedy and Triumph at Mother Emanuel. Would I have felt comfortable doing that had I not had that whole experience with the inaugural poem? Probably not. Or would people have trusted me with their stories? Maybe not. You know, I haven't really unwrapped all that, but I had a sort of trust. People trusted me, I think, in a way they might not have, you know. So, you know, it really changed a lot. It really changed a lot for me. It's still surprising. I think the thing that surprised me, the gratitude for the poem far outweighed the shock of not being allowed to read it.
At least not be able to read it at the inauguration.
Right, right. And then of course I got to read it. You guys might have been there at the rally to take the flag down in front of the State House.
Yes.
6 months later, it was like 500 degrees out. But that was quite something. So, and I hate to think of what happened to get that flag down, but you know, it's always been, we know what it's a symbol of. And I still, if I'm driving and I see a truck with a Confederate flag on it, I get scared. You know, it scares me. So that's not going to change. So, you know, it's just interesting. You know, I think as a poet, we think, oh, who's really reading our poems? And, you know, often they don't enter the mainstream. And yet there's times when a poem really kind of gets out there and speaks to people. And it was, you know, in the end, it being a great blessing, you know, that you know, I wouldn't have written the poem if I hadn't been the poet laureate. So, it's weird. That was 5 years ago, so do you want me to end with that? It's kind of a long poem though.
It's a beautiful poem. I'd love that.
Okay.
We would love it. Yes.
You would love it. Okay. So, okay. I will read it. It was actually published. A lot of these poems were published in Illuminations, which is edited by Simon Lewis in the College of Charleston. But it's sort of an international literary publication. And I guess with our audience, we don't have to explain, I don't think we have to explain who George Stinney was.
Might want to.
Might want to. Well, what's interesting for those of you who have either seen Just Mercy or read the book by Brian Stevenson, he devotes almost a chapter to George Stinney, who's the youngest American executed, young African-American kid who was he and his brother were the last people to see these two little white girls alive. And these girls disappeared. I think it was in Somerton. No, it was near, I forget the little town where it happened, my little town in the middle of South Carolina. And so everybody was out looking for these little girls, and he happened to mention, oh, well, my brother and I saw them picking flowers, the other, a couple days ago. And that was all it took for them to decide that he had killed these little girls. There was no evidence. They ran the family out of town. He had nobody there to stand up for him. I think he sat on a Bible, right, when he was executed. I mean, it's a really horrific story, and kind of a symbol of the Jim Crow era, and that could happen in a little town in South Carolina, right?
It was Pinewood.
Pinewood. Okay, yeah. I feel like I read this poem in somewhere, I can't remember now, but a lot of people were from that town were there. It was really interesting to, people who knew had memories of these families, and it was really interesting. Anyway, One River, One Boat. I have an epigraph by Elizabeth Alexander. I know there's something better down the road. Because our history is a knot we try to unravel while others try to tighten it, we tire easily and fray the cords that bind us. The cord is a slow-moving river spiraling across the land in a succession of S's splintering near the sea. Picture us all crowded onto a boat at the last bend in the river. Watch children stepping off the school bus, parents late for work, grandparents fishing for favorite memories, teachers tapping their desks with red pens, firemen suiting up to save us, nurses making rounds, baristas grinding coffee beans, dock workers unloading apartment-sized containers of computers and toys from factories across the sea. Every morning, a different veteran stands at the base of the bridge, holding a cardboard sign with misspelled words and an empty cup. In fields at daybreak, rows of migrant farm workers standing on ladders break open iced peach blossoms, their breath rising and resting above the frozen fields like clouds. A John boat drifts down the river. Inside, a small boy lies on his back, hands laced behind his head. He watches stars fade from the sky and dreams. Consider the prophet John, calling us from the edge of the wilderness to name the harm that has been done, to make it plain and enter the river and rise. It is not about asking for forgiveness. It is not about bowing our heads in shame, because it all begins and ends here, while workers unearth trenches at Gadsden's Wharf, where 100,000 Africans were imprisoned within brick walls, awaiting auction, death, or worse, where the dead were thrown into the water and the river clogged with corpses has kept centuries of silence. It is time to gather at the edge of the sea and toss wreaths into this watery grave. And it is time to praise the judge who cleared George Stinney's name 70 years after the fact. We honor him. We pray. Here, where the Confederate flag flew beside the State House, haunted by our past, conflicted about the future, at the heart of it, we are at war with ourselves, huddled together on this boat handed down to us, stuck at the last bend of a wide river splintering near the sea.
Thank you.
That was amazing.
This is, we want to thank Marjory Wentworth, our poet laureate in South Carolina. It's been a wonderful few minutes with you. And again, we're really heartfelt for what you've been doing in the poetry community. And you've actually given poets in South Carolina a national platform from your advocacy for social justice. And Chewing the Gristle is very thankful.
Well, you guys are great, and I'm happy to be part of it. And I look forward to, is this going to be every week?
Yes, that's our plan.
Oh, great. All right. Well, anything I can do to help get the word out.
Love you, Marjory.
All right. Love you guys.
You take care.